Well, hello everybody. My name is Jason DeCosta. Thank you for joining me today and welcome to my show called Consistent Preterism. I am driving home at the current moment from basketball. Played a little rec league tonight. Very good run. Feel like I'm getting my legs back, but enough about that. Today I am going to talk about the infamous Prodigal Son parable, specifically from, I believe it's the book of Matthew. And, I think it's in all of them, but the one I'm going to sort of be paraphrasing is from Matthew. And obviously I'm not going to be reading the passage because I'm driving, but I'm just going to paraphrase, and I think you guys are going to get the gist. But before I did that, for those of you who have listened to me, you know that I do attend a church here and there with my lovely girlfriend. And as I've said in the past, for anyone who's new, my girlfriend is of the faith, and it's one of those things in my family where, for the most part, and I don't know who listens to me secretly, I'm sure there are a couple, but for the most part, my family has chosen sort of to ignore it, I think, and not because they think it's wrong, just because I think it's a combination of them thinking it could be right, and also some of them thinking I'm absolutely crazy. So, it's kind of interesting. But they pretty much don't want to hear it. They don't want to, listen. I think if they did really listen, and some of them have, not in the more recent months, as I've developed this more and more, but I just think sometimes it's best just to not say anything, and avoid that sort of confrontation, because first of all, I know that, and what I personally know shows that it's pretty irrelevant in terms of, where we stand today. Could these people be a little bit more open-minded to the possibility of me being right? Sure. But I'm not going to go to war over it anymore, because it's not, of anything that's as crucial as I once thought. But anyway, so yeah, I do attend this church. I sort of just go and support. And like I've said in the past, it's sort of like moral counseling with Jesus attached to it, which is cool. And sometimes I'm sitting there and I'm listening to the pastor, and, and he's got some good life lessons and whatnot. And they do tie it to the Bible. And, I think that's what most people like about church. They don't like to get too deep into the theological, nuances and whatnot, but they go for the feel-good part of it. And I just, was listening and kind of paying attention today, and I realized that, number one, these guys have a really interesting viewpoint. Today, there was a youth pastor that I guess stepped in and was teaching, and I said, hey, you know what, let's give the kid a try, right? He's going to give it a go. He's teaching on Colossians 3. Now, obviously, he goes back and sort of prefaces Colossians 3 with Colossians 2, and he starts talking about how Christ had nailed those handwritten requirements of the law that were against them. And I mean, poor kid, he's making blunder after blunder. He's talking about Christ has nailed our trespasses of the law to the cross. And, and he's basically saying, let no one judge us in terms of new moons and Sabbaths and whatnot. So there really was very little audience relevance applied whatsoever. Oh, I just dropped the phone. Hold on. You guys are in my seat right now, down near my right thigh. There we go. I got you back. So anyways, very little audience relevance going on, if any. And one thing that he was talking about is, I think in Colossians chapter 3, Paul says something about don't get swept away in human tradition or human philosophy or something like that. And so he brought that out and applied it in such a way that says, human tradition can catch on and can be very tough to break. This, no joke, this is what he's saying. And he's saying, Paul is telling them that just because something has been around for a long time and many people, believe in it, or many people, I couldn't believe my ears. He's like, Paul is telling them, you don't have to believe it, right? You don't want to get swept away with human tradition and human philosophy and all this stuff. So he's applying it almost in a religious sense, where these philosophies and these ideas and these concepts and these traditions have been around for centuries, and Paul is telling them, hey, no, this is a new message, I know, and but the irony of it all was that I'm sitting there and I'm thinking to myself, man, if they only would apply that, or if most people would apply that when they hear the truth about the Bible, whether it be full preterism, whether it be consistent preterism, whatever it may be, if they only understood that just because something's been around for centuries and just because something's been tradition and human tradition and everything does not make it right. All right, you have to examine everything according to the proof and the evidence that you're given and come to the best, most logical, reasonable conclusions. You just can't believe something just because people have believed it. So anyways, just a lot of stuff that was flawed there. Obviously, we're in a futurist church that's waiting for the return of Christ. But beyond all that, yeah, I thought it was kind of interesting. And some of the stuff they say is, I guess, semi-applicable. But just a lot of me kind of examining. And if anything, it's good to keep my mind fresh in the scriptures so that I have things to yap about on my show. But anyways, enough about that. Okay, let's get to the point here. The prodigal son. All right, the prodigal son is a very interesting parable that Jesus speaks in the book of Matthew. That's the place I'll be referencing. And the prodigal son is a picture of two sons that dwelled with their father. One son decides he's going to take all of his blessing and all of his inheritance. This is how it's sort of pictured in the parable. And he's going to go out to the countries and roll around with them and in their filth, in their uncleanness, and live all sorts of loosely. In other words, live life loosely. Now, for those of you who know the aerial view of this story, that's exactly what the Israelites did many times in this story. They were forced out into the nations. They were found living in nations, paganized, worshiping idols many times. God, in fact, brought them back one time in the Return to Zion Second Temple period, where he set up a banner for the nations and assembled the outcasts of Israel, called them back through the prophets, Ezra and Nehemiah. And so, anyways, this had happened once before when they returned to the physical promised land, but this is sort of like a anti-type of that type where the Israelites are being gathered into the spiritual promised land, the eternal rest. So, anyways, we see Jesus give this parable, okay, and it's about two sons. All right, now that's key, because if you know anything about the Bible, you know that no other nation knew God. Okay, God said this many times. Amos 3:1, in Psalm 147, 19-20, he says he did not declare his word to any other nation but Israel. He did not declare his laws and his judgments to any other nation but Israel. Okay, so he only knew Israel. In Deuteronomy 4 and Deuteronomy 7, when Moses is outlining the law, the commandments, the statutes, and the ordinances from Yahweh to the people, it says, "What other great nation has this law that your God, Israel, is setting before you this day?" Showing the exclusivity, and then he gets into this whole rant about how God loved them above all peoples of the earth. So anyways, just sit back and ask yourself a question. The whole entire story is focused upon Israel, Old Covenant Israel, who was Abraham's seed. That was whom the promise was fulfilled in, that Abraham's seed would multiply like the stars of heaven in number. That's clear. It's referenced in Deuteronomy about a dozen times. It's referenced when David's counting the children from war. He didn't count those 20 years and under because the Lord had promised he would multiply them like the stars of heaven in number. David knew that that was Israelites. How come people can't figure it out today? So Israel, Old Covenant Israel, fulfilled that promise to become like the stars of heaven in number and to be blessed and have all this blessing and all this stuff. So anyways, we see that no other nation had that relationship. Okay, no other nation was called the people of God, the sons of God, my children. Right? God said, I am the Lord their God. I am the God of Israel. I am the Redeemer of Jacob, the Holy One of Israel. I mean, all these terms, right? All these names, but it always involves him being the God of Israel. So you have these two houses, all right, and they sort of get into all this trouble. They get cast out, they get brought back, they get cast out again, they get brought back. Then we get to the latter days in the last couple centuries before Christ, and we know from places like the Bible, number one, with all these letters going out where these apostles are calling these Israelites back in from the pagan nations. He's we see this happening in the book of Maccabees as well. We see that Israelites were actually leaving the law, uncircumcising, abandoning circumcision, abandoning the Sabbath. There was all sorts of Israelites spread all around the surrounding nations. All right? And so we see this occurring, and we also know that this was sort of predicted at the start, right? This is no news to anybody. As long as we know our Bible, in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 27 and forward, Moses predicted this would happen. He said, "In the latter days, Israelites, you will be scattered out in the nations, paganized, worshiping idols, the work of men's hand, false gods. But God would turn and have mercy upon you and remember the covenant that he made with your fathers." So when did this happen in the timeline of history? When did this occur? It occurred a couple of times. But we see Paul allude to that covenant promise in Galatians 3 when he tells the Israelites in Galatia, "There's neither Jew nor Greek between you guys. If you're Abraham's seed, you're an heir according to that covenant promise." So he refers back to that, sort of letting them know they've received God's mercy. In Romans 9, Paul asks, "Is God also merciful to the Gentiles?" And then he continues to quote a passage from Hosea that is all about dispersed, scattered Israelites and God regathering them. I mean, if he's not lobbing up the softball pitch, I don't know who is. And then he goes on to quote two more passages. One that says, "Isaiah also cries out concerning Israel, although the number of the children of Israel be as the sand of the sea, the remnant will be saved." So who do you think Paul was speaking of when he was talking about God saving and having mercy upon the, quote, Gentiles? These are the scattered Israelites that were living out in the nations. In Romans 11, Paul said, "When the fullness of those Gentiles come in, all Israel will be saved." He's not playing Jedi mind tricks. He's not switching Gentile into some spiritual Israelite. He's speaking of Israelites, and he's talking about the ones who were pagan in the nations. The gospel went to the Jew first to gather the elect Jews that were in and around Judea, and then it sort of slowly moved out to the nations to gather in the fullness of the Gentiles. Jew first, then Gentile. And when the fullness of the Gentiles came in, all Israel would be saved, which occurred at the coming of the Lord, the resurrection, the judgment, and the saints inheriting the kingdom. Now, the prodigal son obviously does not work if it's speaking of pagans, right? Paul said they had a ministry of reconciliation. Well, reconciliation doesn't work unless it first starts with a relationship. But God said he knew nobody other than Israel. He had no sort of covenant, no sort of relationship with any other nation but Israel. So the prodigal son parable with the two sons and one going off rolling around in nations, dirt and muck and filth, taking the inheritance and the blessing that the father gave and forgetting it and saying, screw this, and going out and living loosely among the nations. Do you really think that's pagans? Did pagans begin with God and then go out to live with other pagans? That makes no sense. What makes sense is Israelites collectively as a covenant body, in whatever way it was taking place, and we know for sure from the Bible and from outside sources as well that it was taking place when Christ came. It makes more sense that these are Israelites who left the Father, who abandoned the covenant, who were dead in the trespasses of their sins, who were dead in the uncircumcision of their flesh, who were Gentile in the flesh, meaning like the Gentiles, in their flesh of their foreskin, and who are being gathered back in. After all, Jesus said he only came for the lost sheep. But the prodigal son parable is pretty incredible because if you look at it, it shows that God has mercy on this son. The son realizes what he did and sort of be pictured as kind of coming back to the father. The father waits for him, embraces him, and receives him back. He forgives him. He reconciles him. He has mercy upon him. Right? And this is a perfect picture of Deuteronomy 4:27, where Moses predicted that in the latter days God would have mercy on the Israelites and remember the covenant that he made with their fathers. Now, interestingly enough, in that same parable of the prodigal son in Matthew, what occurs at the end? A feast. Right? The feast is ready. Same exact imagery as the wedding banquet or the marriage feast, the supper of the Lamb. So we have this feast that occurs at the end. And then, even more amazingly, what does Jesus say at the end of that parable, or towards the end of that parable? He says, "For they were once lost, but now have been found." Well, here's the connection, folks. Jesus in that parable says they were once lost, but have now been found. And you ready for the connector? Hold on, let me take a swig of this water so that I can make sure it sounds good. All right. the connector that connects they were once lost but have now been found is Matthew 15:24, which says, I come only for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So who was lost and had now been found? Right? What's that parable of the prodigal son story actually representing? Is it representing pagans who never knew God, somehow losing a relationship with God that they never even had, and then turning back to God to be reconciled to a relationship that they never even had? Doesn't make any sense, right? They're not being bought back. To be bought back, to be redeemed, means that you must have first been a part of something. But when Paul wrote to the Ephesians in chapter 2, he told them that they were alienated from the commonwealth of Israel. They were strangers to the covenants of promise, but Christ had redeemed them. He had forgiven them and had brought them back in to the fold. These were lost sheep. The shepherd was seeking them out, every last one, and bringing them back into the fold. Peter called them the lost sheep when he wrote to them in his epistles. In fact, he refers to Hosea as well, which is all about the lost sheep of the house of Israel. He refers to them as the elect of the dispersion, and then in chapter 2, he refers to them as the lost sheep. They were going astray like lost sheep, about to be killed, but the shepherd of their souls has called them back. So if you can't see that these ones in the nations are lost sheep, then I don't know what to tell you. These are the lost sheep of the house of Israel. That text is an anchor text. Jesus said in Matthew 15:24 that he comes only for them. That's an anchor text. That defines everything we see elsewhere in the nations, in Judea, and everywhere. But again, think about it, folks. It's not very hard. If the parable of the prodigal son is speaking about a son that's living in the nations, dirty, unclean, paganized, filthy, living frivolously, living loosely, wasting his inheritance, wasting his blessing, and then suddenly turns back to God, or to the Father, I should say, because that's what the parable says. The Father turns back to him, has mercy upon him, throws this huge wedding feast, and says, what was lost has now been found. Well, again, if that ain't the lost sheep of the house of Israel, folks, then Jesus was a bad man. You get it? I was a sheep. That sucked. That was a stupid joke. But anyways, that's all I want to teach on the prodigal son. I hope you all enjoyed it. If you have any questions, leave a comment. Let me know. But other than that, hope you all have a wonderful day. I'll be back another day, another time, another place, and another rhyme. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.